we recently did some analysis that found that even under really optimistic electric vehicle adoption scenarios, the US is likely not to meet its climate goals unless it reduces vehicle miles traveled. And what that means is increasing access to alternatives, allowing for more walkability, improving the feasibility of transit. So if you just look at it from pure kind of climate action plan standpoint, we need to see the effects of induced demand incorporated into a larger strategy for reducing transportation emissions.
Aloha, I'm Brennon Morioka, Dean of the UH Manoa's College of Engineering, and I'd like to welcome you to this conversation hosted by the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series, Ulu Point Initiative, and the State Climate Commission. So today we're going to talk about a very vital topic that I've been working on for most of my career. As former head of the state's Department of Transportation, as Deputy Director of the Honolulu Authority for Rapid Transportation, or HART, as General Manager of Electrification of Transportation at Hawaiian Electric Company, and a few others. The topic for today is transportation, in particular, how we move about and how we should best move about in urban areas like Honolulu. In the last century, we talked about improving transportation. We mostly thought about roads, but places like Los Angeles and Houston have proved how hard it is to build your way out of congestion. The more you build, the more cities spread out. As the dangerous effects of climate change close in on us, simply expanding the old model isn't going to be an option. So we need better ways to get around, modes of mobility that are electrified, decarbonized, and also cheaper, more convenient, and that generally make our cities more livable and accessible to all of our community members. But how do we get from here to there in terms of policy, design, and investment? And this is no small problem. So enter our guest today, a nationally recognized expert on urban transformation with the legendary Rocky Mountain Institute, Ben Holland. He has advised state and local governments on transportation investments, strategies to reduce emissions, bus electrification, and land use reform. And he has recently completed research related to the unexpected effects of road expansion in Honolulu and elsewhere. Aloha, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Aloha. Thank you for having me.
So just for our audience and setting a little bit of background and context, since the Roaring 20s, individual automobiles have signified freedom, but we spend so much time trapped within them, stuck in traffic, paying them off, experiences that feel more like punishment than freedom. So maybe broadly speaking, in your opinion, what went wrong?
Well, I think what we've seen is sort of the inevitable outcome of developing our cities and towns around the vehicle. I mean, really, since the Second World War, the priority has been speed of travel. And I think, what was the symbol of freedom has actually become kind of a burden for many people in the United States, an economic burden. And for those who cannot afford a vehicle, very difficult to live in an environment that more or less requires the ownership of a vehicle. So yeah, I think we're dealing with a set of priorities that have developed some unintended consequences.
So speaking of priorities, and priorities is typically indicated by where we invest money, especially from our government entities. So since the Eisenhower administration and the birth of the interstate system, all levels of government have spent huge sums of money on roads, but our commute times only keep increasing. I'm going to ask you to help us understand this paradox a little bit. So how is it that we can continue to invest so heavily in road infrastructure while congestion continues to get worse?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've actually built more, our road infrastructure has expanded at a faster rate than actually our population, and what we've seen is an increase in vehicle miles traveled as a result of that. The autocentric development practices and the highway infrastructure investing that we've seen in recent decades has also given rise to more sprawling and suburban communities, more far-flung exurban communities. So yeah, it's a phenomenon that continues to sort of plague, especially transportation climate action policymakers from state to state.
And you brought up a good term of suburban sprawl too. So let's talk a little bit specifically about Honolulu. And in transportation circles, there's an ironic term for travelers who spend more time or more than 3 hours in traffic per day, and that's called the super commuter. On Oahu, the number of super commuters has gone up about 81% since 2009. Even though the workforce has only increased by 11%. And so maybe from your perspective, what's going on here?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, it surely isn't just purely the highway infrastructure, but changing land use policies, of course, economic drivers as well. You certainly see a spike in vehicle miles traveled and commuting in times when the economy is good and when gas prices are low. Although, of course, gas prices in Hawaii are rarely a bit low. And certainly we're not seeing that nationwide right now. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. It's sort of this bonanza of driving that we've seen in recent years. Vehicle miles traveled and the effort to reduce vehicle miles traveled is long been kind of thought of as this challenge that is, I guess, too difficult to take on. But as an institute, RMI or Rocky Mountain Institute, we're really taking that on now in our work.
Yeah, no, and it is it's a huge focus area. I know nationally, it also is here locally as well. But before we dig deeper into your research and some policy suggestions, I want to make sure all of our audience out there understands the full range of consequences associated with car-based transportation networks. And we here in Hawaii have kind of put ourselves in this position because of we have very narrow singular primary urban cores or corridors that take people from where they live, which is basically suburban sprawl, into the urban core where everybody tends to work, and that inherently becomes the problem. So and as a result, we all know that sitting in traffic is irritating, but what other effects should we be thinking about, positive or negative?
Well, I mean, that background there kind of gives me a little helpful context really about Hawaii, because I have personally not been there. But one of the things that we're really interested in is increasing the amount of housing within their urban cores, really looking at land use solutions to our transportation problems. So that kind of gets at a number of co-benefits, if you will. I mean, not just reducing travel times or vehicle miles traveled and the emissions associated with that, but also enhancing convenience, ensuring that people are able to live close to where they work and close to basic essentials. There was a time when nationwide, especially with older cities, people had walkable access to the most critical of needs, whether it's grocery stores, place of employment, schools, things of that nature. That's become less common. Certainly not, the level of access has decreased in recent decades. So I think, we can get into this in a little bit, but, the land use policies that many cities around the US have essentially made it illegal to live close to work or close to those basic amenities.
Yeah, and you're kind of alluding to what we hear, at least not necessarily in Hawaii, but more specifically here in Honolulu, is a lot of our conversation and focus on transit-oriented development, right? In which, having been with the DOT, the State Department of Transportation, where a lot of our focus was on building roads to kind of help alleviate some of the congestion. when I had left, we were just starting the conversation on rail, and actually that was one of the land use part was more what engaged me in that whole interest in why I ended up working for HART for a number of years. And that was really about not so much just the transportation aspects of rail, but the land use, right? Putting people or allowing people to live closer to where they want to work, where they want to play, do their own activities. And also it was, transit-oriented development was a much greener way of development, right? Because you could provide the same kind of resources on a much smaller footprint. And so I think, what you're alluding to is very much in line with many of the people here. Speak what you will of rail, and because Honolulu is still fairly split on their opinion on rail, especially because of costs. And kind of getting to that is my next question, is that in Hawaii, we often get overwhelmed by the conversation of cost overruns, especially in some of our massive infrastructure projects. But to put matters in perspective, maybe you can share your thoughts on what the true total costs that's associated with vehicle-based transportation.
Yeah, sure. So I think on a sort of household level, Ulupono Initiative actually had a study that came out about a year ago, I think, that found that the average cost per household for owning a vehicle is about $8,100 a year. But sort of the indirect and direct cost total, something on the order of 21 billion per year for the state of Hawaii. Nationwide, I've seen numbers of Greg Schill, for instance, who's a transportation and land use economist, put that number at a total societal cost of about $1 trillion. I've seen estimates upwards of $3 trillion. So a significant portion of our economy is devoted to building and maintaining automobile infrastructure. And again, just at a personal household level, that cost is significant. And when you talk about rail or just transit in general, and there's often those criticisms about the cost of rail, I like to bring up the case study of I-35, Interstate 35 in Austin, Texas, where I've done a fair amount of work. There is a transit package that was just approved by voters about a year ago that is going to invest $7.1 billion, I believe, in a massive expansion of the rail. That thankfully did pass, but not without its detractors, purely because of those cost reasons. An interesting kind of contrast to that is the highway expansion is estimated to be $7.5 billion. Now, those numbers may, vary. We often do see cost overruns, and those costs do increase with time. But you're looking at the potential of dramatically increasing the amount of access people will have to right-of-way, congestion-free transit, compared to a 7-mile stretch of a highway expansion that's largely just going to benefit the suburbs on the north and south side of north and south end of Austin, Texas. It's just often not clear enough, I think, to people what the true costs are of vehicles, because they only really notice it at the pump.
So in your research on transportation investments and carbon emissions, you've underscored the concept of induced demand. And maybe people in Hawaii haven't specifically used the term induced demand, but from what I've heard and in some of the discussions that we've participated in, the concept of induced demand is very much a part of our vernacular. And so maybe you can help our audience understand what induced demand is a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. So on a basic level, it's really the idea that if you're increasing the supply or the capacity of the roadway, that will encourage more people to drive. And in the long-term impacts of that, it's that it offsets any kind of congestion benefit you might get in the near term with expanding roadway. I mean, essentially, like anytime you make something cheaper and more convenient to use, you should expect people to use more of it. And that's kind of been the policy of our transportation investments in the U.S. is to make it easier to drive. And certainly, we have a highway system that is the true cost of which is not paid by the consumer. So what we've seen is with induced demand, we estimate, and this is based on a robust set of empirical research and evidence, I should say, but that finds that on average, for every 1% increase in lane miles on a highway system, you should expect about a 1% increase in vehicle miles traveled. Now, that's going to vary depending on where you are, but and then sort of the dynamics of the roadway, but that's sort of what the research and the evidence has been showing over the recent years. And the best case I can think of, the sort of poster child for induced demand, is the Katy Freeway in Texas, where they've significantly expanded the lane miles of that highway system over decades, really. And you can look at the travel times associated with those expansions. You can see very quickly that congestion levels return to their previous levels. In our research, it's about 5 to 10 years is what you can expect.
Yeah, no, and that's really very similar to what we, when I was at the DOT and what, the DOT currently, when they talk to legislators or to the public in general about, when they get asked about road building and road capacity projects, it really is about, you can build more lanes and accommodate more cars, but at some point you're just encouraging people to drive more, right? Because driving is a choice, or sitting in traffic is a choice, or making different kinds of modal choices is an individual prerogative. And if you make it easier for people to jump in their car, they will. And so now you're discouraging people to ride the bus, carpool, vanpool, whatever it is. Once you start, they start seeing that driving is quicker, there's less traffic. And at some point, like you said, about 5 to 10 years, you're back to where you started after making all of that investment, because now people change their choices to jump back into their cars as a single occupant vehicle. So, I think that's something that we've been talking to. And so maybe, one of the things, I know you, as a part of your research, you developed this shift calculator, and maybe talk a little bit about the shift calculator and why you developed it and how it helps to analyze some of these decisions.
Sure. Yeah. Just quickly, I want to just respond to something you had said. I mean, you kind of touched on something I care about a lot, is a sort of discussion of the trade-offs. There'll be plenty of people that will argue, that's a good thing if you're reducing travel, or, even if you get to congested levels, maybe there's more people on the road accessing things that they want to access by car. But the question comes to mind, that is a small reduction in travel times, even if you were able to lock that in, let's say like 50 seconds, on average off of your commute, the significant cost to build that highway infrastructure, financial costs, as well as, carbon costs, which we can get into, but is that worth the alternative? I mean, it's just at a pure investment level for state DOTs. There is the option to invest in those alternatives, making safer routes for children to get to school, and improving the convenience and efficiency of public transit. So we created the shift calculator as a tool to really just very clearly quantify, based on the evidence that we've seen, what you could expect what you could expect from a carbon emissions and vehicle miles traveled impact from a highway expansion. So I'll give you a little bit of the background and history of it, but the original sort of the genesis of this project was with UC Davis. Susan Handy and Jamie Volker over there developed the California Induced Demand calculator. We partnered with them and NRDC to create a calculator, and NRDC is the Natural Resources Defense Council, to create a calculator that was really focused on the state of Colorado and measuring the impacts of 10 different projects. Now, the state of Colorado has a goal to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 10% by 2030, I believe. But we found, using that tool, that the existing projects on the books would actually increase VMT by 2 to 3% over the same time period. that created quite a stir in Colorado, which is, it's quite a progressive state from policymaking standpoint, and a lot of really great people in the Colorado Energy Office, very concerned about climate, including the Governor Jared Polis. But, I think this was a concept that wasn't really discussed in environmental circles so much. So we got significant amount of positive feedback on that. So we decided to expand it to 50 states. So from a user's perspective, you can go to shift.rmi.org and select the state which you're interested in, the type of highway system, it's a major interstate or maybe an arterial, and any county in the US, you can measure the carbon emission, the greenhouse gas emissions impacts and vehicle miles traveled impacts of a highway expansion. So we've gotten a good amount of positive feedback on the tool, and we're really pleased to hear that it's being used by some DOTs as well as some metropolitan planning organizations as well.
So what are some of the implications that induced demand would have for Honolulu in particular?
Well, so I think I'm not terribly familiar with the specific projects in Honolulu, but if you're thinking about sort of these trade-offs of investing in, for instance, bus priority lanes or right-of-way for public transit, bike infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure, you've got there are real financial trade-offs there. And I know that the state of Hawaii, of course, is has very progressive policies around renewable energy and climate change. So I should probably provide some more feedback, or not feedback, but background on this. But as an institute, we've really sort of elevated the importance of vehicle miles traveled reduction from a carbon emissions mitigation standpoint. And that is because we recently did some analysis that found that even under really optimistic electric vehicle adoption scenarios, the US is likely not to meet its climate goals unless it reduces vehicle miles traveled. And what that means is increasing access to alternatives, allowing for more walkability, improving the feasibility of transit. So if you just look at it from pure kind of climate action plan standpoint, we need to see the effects of induced demand incorporated into a larger strategy for reducing transportation emissions. So the way I think about it is, if you care about reducing vehicle miles traveled or getting people into alternatives, the first order of business is not to sort of willfully expand it or willfully increase those miles and emissions through highway expansion. So I think for Honolulu and its future climate aspirations, it's certainly something that needs to be taken into account in a meaningful way.
Yeah, no, and I think very good points. And from what I can tell, just from the conversation that I've listened in on with the DOT, is that they've recently really focused away from some of the large capacity building projects and looked more at optimization and efficiency type projects that we talked a little bit earlier about. So I think you do have a DOT administration here that is looking at optimizing its individual dollars and trying to get the biggest cost benefit out of the public monies that we have. Hawaii doesn't get a whole lot of money, and our revenue base from all of our different highway fees and taxes also don't really keep up with having to build more roads. So we do need to be creative and look for alternatives. And you kind of started talking about alternative modes of transportation, walkability. So basically, it's not just those who are in the cars or the drivers. So how does induced demand affect drivers versus non-drivers? Or is there some kind of differentiator that the two different demographics can see?
Yeah, for the non-drivers, so I think this is often not really considered, but there's a significant population that cannot or chooses not to drive, whether they're too young or too old, or they're disabled in some way. The significant population, I've heard it estimated as 30% of people at a given time aren't able to drive. I mean, that's there's a lot of children and elderly that could use a lot better resources, a lot better facilities, and often the highways and highway investment takes priority over amenities that would improve their quality of life. And this highway expansion rarely, just purely expanding the highway, especially if you don't have sort of a bus priority lane or HOV lane or something of that nature, that's just going to make it even more of a sort of prohibitive environment for pedestrians and non-drivers. Every dollar spent toward expansion of highways is a dollar that could be spent toward, investing in those amenities. Of course, and we can get into this a little bit, but of course, there's very basic needs of repairing and maintaining the existing infrastructure we have. So I think there is a real direct impact on sort of the quality of lives for those that cannot or choose not to drive.
And you've kind of touched on this, my next question, a little bit in some of all of your different answers. But just to play devil's advocate for a moment, and we've had to deal with this from a transportation industry decision-making body, with the DOT and HART and the City Department of Transportation Services. Some critics will say that induced demand is really just latent demand. And one of the difficulties that we have as policymakers is convincing the general public, elected officials who are also decision makers. And how do you counter some of that argument that we should be doing this because there is that demand that already exists?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly highway expansion will generate demand, and there also is just sort of latent demand. I mean, that's the fact of life, I think. And we sort of we're kind of just really direct about that, really. I mean, even if you're going to really develop a transportation climate strategy, you have to take that into account. There are a number of, and we talked about this a little bit, but there are a number of other investments and alternatives that could provide, more reliable, more convenient, preferable alternatives, I guess, for those that would be considered the latent demand, I guess. Certainly making it that much easier to drive. There's a number of people that were maybe are currently not taking the trips that they would have otherwise, or they're taking public transit that may shift to that highway now. So, I mean, that's just something that we have to account for, I think. But yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's really about changing the narrative and trying to elevate the importance of you getting those people into or get to where they need to be with better modes. So improving street grid connectivity, improving land use. So, things like, grocery stores are in closer proximity to them, or,
right.
places for recreation.
Right. So, I mean, the traditional transportation concept has been just, you get more congestion, you build more road, right? So that's the old school train of thought on how to address congestion. So, dealing with induced demand and other ways of alternative modes of transportation is really changing philosophy. It's changing the approach. So what has been your reaction by transportation engineers and other officials to your research?
There's been a great deal of positive feedback. The transportation departments, and they often have, I mean, they always have their own kind of travel demand models. I think, from just a personal experience, I'll give you the example of Colorado releasing the sort of study, if you want to call it that. It was really a blog associated with our Colorado Induced Demand calculator. Really helped generate this conversation in the state of Colorado. And we now have a nice working relationship with Colorado Department of Transportation. We've provided feedback on their modeling. They're now incorporating induced demand into their modeling. So I think it's largely been positive. I mean, it's been we've fielded a lot of requests from DOTs as well as metropolitan planning organizations to do a run through of the tool, and have found that we're actually quite pleasantly surprised to find that so many DOTs and leadership around so many states have started to take this concept of induced demand much more seriously. So pretty optimistic about that. I mean, there's also, this concept of level of service, or, transportation investments that are really geared toward, even at the local kind of urban level, expanding highways. State of California just recently moved to a sort of vehicle miles travel metric, where previously their road transportation engineering was really based on this level of service idea, which is essentially what they do is they take the 15 busiest minutes of basically the busiest hour of the day, and look at how the travel is flowing, and they put a grade level on it. So if you have complete free flow of traffic, they'll give it a grade level of A. And there's some great photos out there that show you a grade level of A versus F or something like that for roads. And typically what you see for a low performing road from a level of service perspective are the kinds of environments that we all love being in, that are kind of congested, but they're sort of vibrant streets and downtown communities. I mean, you think of New York or even New Orleans, and really any city. So many cities in every state across the country has that kind of environment where, like, from a classic transportation engineering perspective, if you were to expand those roadways in a way to increase the flow of traffic, you would lose that great character that you see for a vibrant downtown.
Right. So you've mentioned it a number of times about carbon emissions and climate change, and why is it important that we get this next round of future transportation infrastructure design right?
So RMI, just like many other environmental nonprofits, has really kind of aligned its work around the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 1.5 degrees carbon budget, essentially limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And then we looked in the US sector by sector what would be necessary to reach that goal. And for transportation, our analysis shows that we would need to see about a 45% reduction in transportation carbon emissions by 2030 in order to stay on target with that IPCC goal. And what that's equivalent to is going from essentially 2 million EVs on the road, or electric vehicles on the road today, to 70 million by 2030, so less than 8 years. And even given that scenario, we'd have to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20% per capita. Now, this is, if you look at the classic kind of climate action plan or traditional kind of climate modeling, from a transportation perspective, it's almost always entirely focused on some future projection of electric vehicle adoptions, typically out to 2050. What it doesn't take into account is sort of the cumulative emissions that we see over the coming years up to 2030. So it's really kind of this make or break moment right now that we're in, especially now with the infrastructure law being passed, and the significant amount of funding that's going to coming from the federal government down to the state DOTs. How that's used by the state DOTs is really going to have a big impact on sort of where we go, how successful we are really from a transportation climate policy perspective. So the Georgetown Climate Center out of DC recently put out a report that found that under a business as usual investment perspective, or investment approach, so basically highway expansions, minimal investment in alternatives, just sort of the classic conventional approach to using funds. If that were to take place with this existing round of funding, you would see an increase in transportation emissions. So it's really critical for states to invest in low carbon, zero carbon transportation investments. So.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And I'm glad you mentioned electric vehicles, and because that was a very important part of my work at Hawaiian Electric. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But so if we can close the conversation on transportation initiatives or projects, knowing that the traditional lane expansion, highway construction, and especially with the new infrastructure bill coming out, what should we be doing instead? And maybe what are some ideas of promising little fixes or small changes that can ultimately add up?
Yeah, so there is a significant amount of flexibility that states have in how they can use the funding. I mean, history kind of suggests that that they tend to spend just as much, sometimes more, on expansions than they do on repairs. I think what we've seen sort of in the carbon emissions modeling is that the expansion piece is one of the biggest levers, if not the biggest lever. Of course, electrification is hugely important, but just simply moving away from an expansion priority to one of, so we'll call it fix it first, fixing what we have. There's a significant backlog of maintenance and repairs that state DOTs around the country have committed to spending down. There's I think seeing an order between like $200 to $800 billion in repair needs on the highway system. The states have in their power to, instead of investing in expansions, investing in safe streets, investing in bus priority lanes, better bike infrastructure, all these investments that make walking, biking, and transit that much more feasible, convenient, and preferable to owning and driving a personal vehicle. So this is, again, it is very much a make or break moment. The federal government can only do so much. It's going to come down to how the state DOTs use the funds.
All very important conversations, and yet very difficult conversations.
Yeah.
I've been a part of those, and they're definitely not easy because everybody has their opinions and everybody is passionate about that position. So I'm not enviable or envious of those who have to participate in those conversations. So, but let's take a little look farther over the horizon with the rise of Tesla and other competitors like Tesla, where one vision of the future coming into view looks quite like our own, all of us moving around in individual vehicles, but electric ones powered by renewables. Is this the kind of future that we want? Why or why not?
So, I mean, again, electric vehicles obviously are critical, and especially paired with renewables in a state like Hawaii that has, the most ambitious renewable energy standard and a significant market or as usage of renewable energy. That paired with electrification is amazing. From a kind of an equity standpoint and air pollution standpoint as well, electrified sprawl is still a problem. A significant part, going back to the pollution piece, a significant part of kind of carbon pollutants like PM 2.5, that's really comes down to a lot of tire wear, brake wear, road wear that electric vehicles are certainly going to help to some extent, especially with the regenerative braking, but still a certainly public health issue associated with electrified sprawl, essentially. But there are, I don't want to downplay the benefits though of electric vehicles, and certainly paired with renewables and then battery storage systems, we see significant opportunity there. But yeah, the same topic comes up if we want to talk about this, but autonomous vehicles as well. So
Right.
the potential to just exacerbate the sprawl. There's also, don't want to get into this too much, but there is some argument that as the cost to operate an electric vehicle comes down, there could be somewhat of a rebound in the use of the vehicles, because the cost per mile of driving an electric vehicle is just so much less than an internal combustion vehicle. So you could potentially see an increase in vehicle miles traveled.
So knowing that you don't have a crystal ball to see into the future, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. That if we were to make the right sorts of investments in transportation, what do you think the mobility experience could be in Honolulu in, say, 10 years from now, or even further out at 20, 25, or 30 years in our future?
So I think, we've talked a lot about the solutions available, but really investing in those alternatives, and then also pairing land use with transportation investments in a bigger way. There have been some efforts to do that, to tie the funding availability to metropolitan planning organizations and grantees in a way that ensures that those recipients of the funding are also thinking about ways to reform their land use. So, reforming single family zoning to allow more infill development, duplexes and quadplexes, putting houses closer to destinations, essentially. I think we'd all like to see more of a holistic vision for land use and transportation planning. They are too often planned in isolation. I mean, certainly every metropolitan planning organization is considering those things together, but ultimately some of the decisions are made in isolation from one another. So I'd like to see more of that. Going back to the EV piece, I'd like to see a significant amount of the funding going toward putting charging infrastructure, in lower income neighborhoods and multifamily apartment complexes, certainly on the corridors where they're needed. But I think there's a real need for the electric vehicle funding as well to really benefit the cities, because there has been a reliance on deploying that infrastructure in sort of regional, sort of city to city highway corridors.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate your comment about the more holistic view of planning of infrastructure and just in general. I know the federal government tried a number of years ago to incorporate transportation planning, land use and housing planning with environmental planning. And I know we're trying to do that here, but it's a very difficult thing. So I can appreciate the challenges there. How's your optimism on what should be done actually can be done, and or will it be done, and maybe why or why not?
I think it's getting better actually. We identified, and we're not the only ones, but in the time that we started kind of promoting the EVs and VMT reduction strategy, we've seen a significant amount of interest in that at the policymaker level. We've seen state DOTs really take leadership on sort of the right investment priorities. We've seen this sort of climate philanthropic community embrace a more comprehensive approach to transportation climate strategy. U.S. Department of Transportation has an amazing team working right now under Secretary Buttigieg. I'm very optimistic about that. I'm very optimistic at the leadership there and in many states across the United States. I think there's still a lot to be determined, I think, in the next few months. And I keep saying this, but we are sort of this make or break moment. I think for many of the more kind of progressive states, the governors and the leadership and the DOTs there recognize that. So I'm excited to see how it unfolds, really.
Well, Ben, we've come to the end. I have been fascinated by your comments and some of your research. So thank you very much for your work and your insight and for joining us today. I also want to thank the mostly student staff here at UH's Better Tomorrow Speaker Series and the Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission for managing this program behind the scenes. I'd also like to extend our gratitude to the series sponsors, including the Hawaii Community Foundation, Kamehameha Schools, and the Ulupono Initiative. So mahalo very much especially to all of you for joining us here today to listen in on a topic of great importance to all of us here at home in Hawaii. So mahalo and aloha.
Mahalo.